Thank you, Yvette. And, thank you to the National Center. Yeah, they brought me on as a new client. They've been an amazing resource for me, and I love that they do these kind of things for all of you. And this is going to be exciting. I'm glad you guys got some hot soup because it's super cold in this room. So now you won't be out there shivering. So we're going to talk about just some key components. I've got over 30 years experience in HR, and I'm going to try to cram that all into about 45 minutes. So bear with me if I'm going like a bullet train. So HR, there's an employee life cycle. And this applies, the employee life cycle is the same whether you are a large business, small business, tribally owned business, a business with an HR department, or a business without an HR department. They all go through the same cycle. There's the first step is recruiting and selection. You have to pick your employees, you have to recruit them. And then there's onboarding and integration. Managing their performance. And then managing training and development. Not every organization actually offers training and development, but it is a key component in a successful employee life cycle. And then there's retention. You have to have strategies for retention. And we all know in today's market, when everything is in such flux and it's so hard to recruit employees, it's really important that we retain the employees that we have, because there's not a million of them lined out the back door waiting to take their place. It's very difficult right now to even recruit. And then you have the separation process. If at some point, either through retirement or through involuntary separation, your employees will leave. So those are the basic life cycles, and we're going to try to kind of cover a little bit on all of them. But first I want to touch base on the foundations of employment law. Foundation of employment law for private organizations, for non-tribal government organizations, are basically centered around the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution kind of lays out all of the premise and the foundation. And then you've got federal employment law. And then you've got state law. And then, sometimes unions actually have an impact on how we're managing our employees in the organization. So these are kind of the foundations of the employment law. Private employers, they have to follow major federal laws. So the EEOC, which covers age discrimination, disability discrimination, the Equal Pay Act, harassment, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Then there's the wage and hour laws, which cover minimum wage, it covers overtime, it covers child labor laws, covers the Family Medical Leave Act. And then OSHA, which oversees Workplace Safety and Whistleblowing Act. Private employers also have to follow state law. Unless you are a government employee, you have to follow state law. So every state has to follow federal law. However, many states have laws, employment laws, that are way more generous to the employees than the federal law. So depending on what state you live in, if you live in Washington State, for example, very, very generous to employees. They've got a very generous family medical leave, and their minimum wage is now $15.74. Federal law is only $7, like 25, I can't even remember, honestly. So $15.74 to $7, that's pretty generous. State of California also has very generous leave laws, parental leave, maternity leave, disability leave. So private employers have to follow the state law that is more generous to the employer. So then, now let's talk about what the difference is for tribal. People always ask me, what's the difference in tribal HR? And so I've been in human resources for over 30 years. I've been working tribal human resources for over 25. So most of my career has been working with tribes, tribal entities, regulatory agencies, just the whole gamut. So tribal HR, there is a difference. There's a significant difference. The differences about tribal HR is it starts with the sovereignty, the abilities of tribes to govern themselves. And then the employment law, there are some differences in the employment law that tribes are afforded. But we also have to consider culture and tradition. When I bring in a non-tribal HR person who's never worked with tribes, never been exposed to tribes, and I bring them into HR, it doesn't matter how much experience they have in HR. There is a learning curve, a significant learning curve for them to be able to function in a tribal environment. So culture and tradition is definitely a very unique aspect of human resources. So just a quick, I'm pretty sure you guys all have this down. Tribal sovereignty, basically the goal of tribal sovereignty is to be self-determined. You know, the tribe sets a goal and they define how they will achieve that goal. And the tool they use is sovereignty. So that changes the foundations of tribal employment law. Tribal employment law centers around the tribal constitution. So tribal constitutions that are written to include labor laws are wonderful. I mean, and I love them because then I've got a foundation I can work off of. So the tribal constitution, TARO, the Tribal Employment Rights Ordinance comes into play, tribal employment codes. Hopefully tribes are writing their own employment codes. If you write your own tribal employment codes and you write them as well as or better than the federal government has nothing, they have no desire to even come in and say you need to follow our laws because you're doing better than them. So tribal employment codes are super important. And then there are some federal laws that tribes have to follow. And there are some times that some tribes have to follow them and others don't. So tribal employers are specifically exempted from ADA as it applies to employment accommodation and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is that which covers discrimination against race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, gender, etc. Tribes are exempt from that. And the reason they're exempt from that is to allow them to exercise Indian preference, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So Title VII and ADA. All the other laws the courts are silent on. So it doesn't mean that tribes have to follow them, or it doesn't mean that they don't. It just means that every time something comes up and goes to court, the court decides what the fate is of that law. And so tribes, you know, the government doesn't really want to come in and dictate employment law for tribes. Again, I go back to that's why it's really important to have your own tribal codes, employment codes, labor laws, a strong constitution. So Indian preference entitles tribal members first consideration in employment, training, contracting, subcontracting, business opportunities. Some of that is what you've already talked about this morning with the contracting and subcontracting. So Indian preference is actually not a racial preference. It's not a racial preference. The courts have found that it is a political preference. So we allow Indian preference, we allow our tribal members the first opportunity in employment, not because they are Native American, but because they are members of a sovereign government. And as a sovereign government, we want to hire our own employees. It's political. So if you think about it, tribes are sovereign nations, right? They're independent. If you go to France and you apply for a job, they're probably going to give first preference to French citizens because it's political, not racial. So it's a political preference. Your tribal employment codes, this defines the terms and conditions of the employment relationship and applies those rules. So your tribal employment codes could be things such as, instead of having a Family Medical Leave Act, you have a tribal family medical code or tribal family medical law. Instead of Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, you have your Tribal Wage and Hour Act. And so you cover all those conditions of employment in the Tribal Employment Code. So because, again, tribes define the rules for the creation of employment code, regulations, handbooks, policies, and procedures. If you have strong codes, policies, and procedures, you don't have to worry about an outside lawsuit. How does culture and tradition fit in? This is my favorite part. How does culture and tradition fit in? Well, it's the very foundation of the employment relationship. As soon as you hire an employee, you need to talk to them about your tribe's culture, your traditions. They need to know who they work for. They need to know the tribal history. So when we inspire a pride in the employees of who they're working for, we inspire a motivation to be more engaged in the organization. So you include this in your orientation. I often say you should have, when you do your employee orientation, have a welcome from your tribal leadership that says, welcome to, I'm going to use my own tribe. Welcome to Citizen Potawatomi Nation. We're so proud to have you here. Here's the history of our tribe. Here's why you're here, and here's what you're allowing us to do. And it builds a sense of pride in all employees, even if they're not tribal members. Your policies you need to give a nod towards your tradition and culture. Your policies, and this is something I run into all the time. You know, we have every tribe has their own traditions and cultures, right? And so some of those surround funerals, and some tribes, it's a 5-day process of a funeral. And other tribes may have like an annual festival, and they expect all tribal employees to attend. Some tribes may say, if we call an emergency meeting of all tribal members, we want them to drop everything and be there. So you have to allow for that in your policies. You have to, how do you manage to help your employee who's a tribal member keep true to their own traditions as well? So you incorporate those into your policies. And people say, Karla, that's not fair. Why do tribal members get an extra day off just because they have a feast or festival? Because we're sovereign, because we can. Now, if we want to make it absolutely fair, then let's say all employees get 5 days off for a funeral, or all employees have a floating holiday that they can use for anything. But we have to not work against the tribe's cultures and traditions, because that frustrates the relationship between the employees and management, and it denies the culture and tradition of the tribe, which we really need to be just enhancing. So, for example, I worked with a tribe that they had an annual festival, and all tribal members were expected to attend. And all tribal members who worked for this tribe's casino would just be gone that day. And they would just take off. And it frustrated the supervisors because they said, well, I never know what to expect, which I kind of laughed about. I go, you do know what to expect because you know they're going to be gone every year on this date. However, we can require that the employees notify the supervisor that they're going to be gone on that date. So we've built that into the policies. Like, tribal employees are allowed to be gone on this date, but they need to notify the supervisor so the supervisor can schedule accordingly. So we need to build these things. Instead of working against them, we need to build them into our policies. We just really want to inspire pride of who we're working for. Any questions on that before I move on? I'm kind of passionate about that. Okay. All right. Recruitment and selection. If you don't recruit the right person, then you're going to spend their entire employee life cycle fighting to try to get them to be a good fit, or trying to get them to be an employee that you want to work with. So recruit right in the first place. I know it's really tempting because we're desperate to get somebody hired, so it's tempting to hire somebody and just get it done. But if you don't hire the right person, you can spend a lot of time in developing them and redirecting them. So the first step in recruitment, pre-recruitment, is, what are your labor needs? Who do you need? How many employees do you need? You need to develop a job description. I'm going to cover job descriptions in a little bit, but if you don't have a good job description, then are you hiring the right person for the job? Because they're looking at that job description going, oh, this is the job I want to do. And then, if that's not what it really is, then you're misleading them, and they could be disillusioned when they come along. Your recruitment and sourcing. We need to be proactive in how we search, especially in today's market. How many of you are having trouble hiring employees right now? Yeah, I see a few hands. And it depends on the job, too. There's some jobs that are a lot more difficult than others. The COVID caused a shift in priorities for our potential employees. So the shift in priorities has created a need for us to get a little bit more creative with how we manage employees. So there's a lot of demand for hybrid or remote work. There's a demand for flexible work. There's a demand for work-life balance. Employees want to belong to an organization that means something and has a sense of purpose. And so all of these things have shifted. Family values became much more important to your everyday person than they used to be. Most tribes I've ever worked with, family values has always been at the forefront. But when those family values shifted, then they started reevaluating. Do I want to get up and go to work at a 9-to-5 job every day, have no break, be exhausted when I get home, not see my kids, not be able to go to their football games? Those priorities shifted quite a lot. So we need to be proactive in how we're searching. Employees are no longer looking for jobs, and we can just sit back and wait for them to come to us. We have to go out and find them. And then your applicant screening and your interview is part of the recruitment and selection process. It's important to screen and make sure you are hiring the right person. So your labor needs, to analyze your labor needs, you need to look at what is the demand. And that's what I just kind of talked about. What is the demand? What do you need? How many vacancies do you have? Do you really need to fill them? You have to ask yourself that. We've gotten a little creative after the pandemic on how we staff. What is your turnover? Are you looking at some potential retirements? And when you have retirements, you're going to lose that knowledge and skill and ability of those people that are retiring. I work with a client who has all of their key employees, all of their management staff have been there 20 to 40 years. I mean, that's amazing, right? I don't know any organization where all of their management staff has been there that long. That's a great thing, but it's also a bad thing because they're all at retirement age now. And they're all ready to retire, so we've got like 10 spots that we have no succession plan for. The company's not going to survive. So you have to have those plans ahead of time. Are you going to be losing key knowledge, skills, and abilities with employees that are retiring? And then what is the supply? What's out there? Do you have any employees inside that can fill these spots? Is it easy for you to recruit? Are you in a remote location? Because a lot of the tribes I work with are in very remote locations with limited access to candidates and candidate pools. Or they're competing with a large city that can pay a lot more. What are you looking for in the future? Do you have any training and development that you can do in order to bring employees up to the level that you need? So what's the gap analysis is simply what's the gap between what we need and what is out there. And then you have to develop a strategy, retention, like I talked about. It's a lot easier to retain employees than it is to recruit them and train them and develop them and build them. Do you need to have a leaner organization? Do you really need to fill those spots? You have to look at that. What is our strategy to recruit? And what is our strategy to develop them once we get them on? What kind of internal training? And what does our succession planning look like? And that's what I talked about a minute ago with the succession planning. What's going to happen if these key employees leave? What are we going to do? So job descriptions, I think, are the foundation of the employee relationship. Job descriptions fill so many purposes. So we're going to kind of talk about how we develop through a job analysis, what the purpose is, and I'm not going to go over sample job description. I apologize that's in here, but there is not enough time in today's presentation to do that. So job descriptions are the foundation of the employee relationship because they help us identify the right employee for the job. And that's really critical. And some of you know that you could take months to find the exact right position, especially if it's a position that's unique or one that you have a special, you really have a special requirement. You're looking for just the right employee for. It could take a long time. What are the essential duties and abilities that it takes to perform the job? How do you know, how do you know what the qualifications are to do a job? You have to do a little bit of research. A lot of people, I don't know if they do this now, but early in my career, I would look at a job description and go, where did you get this job description? Oh, we just found it on the internet. There was another office manager job description, so we just pulled that. It's like, but it's not relevant to what you're looking for. So you can't just go out and pull information from other sources. You got to really develop it internally. Job descriptions describe the legitimate minimum qualifications, help us identify whether they're exempt or non-exempt, and that's based a lot on duties. Half of the exemption test is based on duties. And then it supports your documentation in performance management. So if you're writing an employee up because they're not doing their job, your foundation is the job description. And the first thing that an adjudicator will ask you in unemployment is, did they know what you expected of them? And you say, absolutely, I have a signed job description where they signed this, they knew this was their job description. That's how you prove it. And so that's really important support documentation later on. Or when the employee says, that's not my job. They go, well, look, here it is your job. So job analysis really looks at two things. It looks at the task analysis, what are the duties that need to be done, and it looks at the knowledge and skills and abilities to do the job. And we do, let me back up, sorry. We do job analysis by interviewing incumbents in the job. Basically, who knows best about how the job is done other than somebody who's doing it? So we sit down and we say, what are the typical duties that you do in your job? How long does it take you to do them? How often do you do them? How difficult are they? What kind of decisions do you have to make? How much authority do you have? How much, what supervisory duties do you have to do? And so we look at all of the components of the tasks. And then we look at, well, what kind of background would you need in order to do this job? And what kind of knowledge and skills and abilities would you need to do this job? And we look at that and we put it together, and it helps us to build the foundation of a job description. So job description, what should be included? We like to see the demographic info. What department, what are the reporting relationships? Who does this position report to? Who reports to them? What's the work schedule? We do a quick overview, and the position summary is the reason the position exists. It should just be a little short summary that says this position exists in order to oversee all the financial operations in the organization. It's just a summary. And then we cover the detailed essential duties. What duties are related to that position overview. And then what other duties they have. There's always the other duties as assigned, right? Well, if there's some that let's put them in there. If you know that they're occasionally going to have to cover the front desk, and put occasionally cover the front desk. And then we want to look at the qualifications. What education, what experience, what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities? And people are always, this is what I run into a lot. It's like, well, if I say I want a bachelor's degree required and somebody applies who's a great fit, but they only have an associate's degree, what do I do? Well, if you say it requires a bachelor's degree and it's a hard statement, then you're violating and you're discriminating against other employees if you hire that person. Because other employees or other candidates who didn't have a bachelor's degree might have applied had they known you were going to make an exception. So you don't want to paint yourself into a corner. My recommendation is always to have a disclaimer that says a combination of education and experience may be considered in lieu of education, so that you're not painting yourself into concern. Or you can even say, we absolutely require an associate's degree, but we prefer a bachelor's degree. What that allows is for all the employees or all the candidates who want to apply, who have an associate's degree, will apply, but then you can weed out the ones who have a bachelor's degree because they're your preferred. So it allows you to get a bigger pool. So don't paint yourself into a corner with that, but be realistic of what you really think you need. Disclaimers, those are things like, ABC tribe exercises Indian preference. We will hire tribal members first and then consider others. It would be something like, we are a drug-free workplace. You will be required to take a drug test. So it's all up front, and employees know, if I take this job, I'm going to have to take a drug test. And you probably should let them know up front. You don't want to waste their time having somebody come in that you end up can't hiring. I had an employee we hired. It was a key position, and he moved his family of 5 across the United States, all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. And when he got on site, did drug test, he failed the drug test. Man, I felt really bad, but he knew he was going to be drug tested. It was everything that the offer letter stated it, the job description stated it, everything stated it. So, and I said, what were you thinking? And he said, well, somebody threw me a going away party when I left my other place. I'm like, that's not an excuse. I can't hire you. You're going to have, and I felt really bad, but we made all the disclaimers. So as long as they know up front what's going to be expected. Okay. Sources, you have your traditional sources, your online classified, your search engines such as Indeed, Career Builder, Monster. Social media is really big right now for recruiting. If you have a Facebook page, you use your LinkedIn, Twitter. People often forget the internal sources. Post for promotions, you have promotional positions, employee referrals. Build in a referral plan, succession planning, and then you can outsource to executive recruiters, placement agencies, temp agencies if necessary. They cost money though. We try to do all our recruiting for free, right? We don't want to spend money. Hiring the best candidate for every job is a goal, and it's a critical part of the process is the actual interview. When you're doing an interview, you're not just interviewing them, they're interviewing you. And so you're setting a stage for the future of employment. Ask questions that are specific to the job. Don't be vague, be very specific. The more specific you are, the more information that you'll gain from them. Ask behavioral-based questions. Behavioral-based questions is based on that premise that past behavior predicts future behavior. So you ask something like, how have you handled a difficult customer in the past? Or how would you react in a situation where you have a difficult customer that comes in and is verbally attacking you? So ask questions that makes them think. Instead of, for example, your candidate, this job requires conflict resolution skills. Do you have conflict resolution skills? What are they going to say? Oh, yeah, I do. So let's find out what their skills are. Let's ask a better questions, like how would you handle a situation where you're in conflict with a customer or a vendor or another employee? So behavioral interview questions help you identify if they're going to behave in the way that you basically need. Some interview questions you could ask. Give an example of a goal that you reached and how you achieved it. And describe a work-related conflict and how you resolved it. Please share an example of how you were able to motivate employees in the past. And have you handled a difficult situation with a customer? How? These are examples of behavior-based questions. Sorry, I'm going to rocket through this. Use an interview rating sheet. The reason why I recommend this is because everybody is rated the same way. So if you have a panel of interviews, they're all using the same sheet, they all have the same criteria. And so this is just an example one. It says, I'm going to give 3 points for experience. I'm going to give, so many points for their evidence of reasoning and judgment. I like to take it a step further, and I like to give examples of what would be a level 3 and what would be a level 2 and what would be a level 1. So have everybody use the same rating sheet so that it's consistent. So gather all your information, select the best candidate. A contingent offer is basically what I did with that gentleman that moved across the country. Dear Joe, we'd like to offer you the job. It is contingent upon you passing a background test, a drug test, and anything else that you have a contingency for. So you make a contingent offer. And the reason you make a contingent offer is because you can't really drug test somebody until you've made an offer to them. And you don't want to spend money giving background check or reference checks for all your all your candidates. So you just make the contingent offer, do your background, do your drug, do your references. And again, they're interviewing you. I've turned down jobs because the interview was so horrible. It gives me an indication of what it looks like. I'm like, I don't want to work there. They were an hour late. They were just, disorganized. They're disrespectful. So be on time, be communicative, respect them during the interview. And give respect for those who don't get the job. Make sure you do a follow-up, a reply, a response. Thank you for applying. We appreciated you coming in. However, we've selected another candidate. It's horrible to sit out there and wait for an answer. So as soon as you know you're not going to hire somebody, you should let them know. And then the onboarding process. Here's the picture I have. Pushing somebody out of an airplane without giving them a parachute. That's pretty much what you're doing if you are not doing an orientation and onboarding process. Orientation is that one-time event when they first come on where you give them a broad view of the organization, you give them the basics of the job, you give them the policies and procedures, you do all the orientation things. And it usually doesn't last more than a week. Some people, orientation is 2 hours. Some people, it's a week long. Many, many years ago, and I don't know if they still do it like this, but Harrah's was like 4 days long, their orientation. And so, depends on what you want. But orientation is important. But more important is onboarding. Onboarding it can last anywhere from 30 days to a year. So this This onboarding is a continuous process of making sure the employee is a good fit, that they're comfortable, that they're getting the answers. It's a communication process and a feedback process. Onboarding allows you, to create a successful employee through your connection. You're making connections with them. You're not just hiring them and pushing them out the door. Introduction and indoctrination into the culture, the organizational culture, the tribal culture, the departmental culture, and then a constant availability of communication. So new hire orientation, we usually introduce them to the culture, we introduce them to the executive team, we talk about their pay and their benefits and the rules and the handbooks and the safety. Maybe we give them a tour, they sign all their new hire paperwork. And then beyond the first week, check in or check back with them. Monitor your turnover rates. Conduct exit interviews when employees leave. And I have seen the worst of onboarding, and I've seen the best of onboarding. The worst of the worst was an employee showed up first day of work to a deli in the casino, showed up, supervisor wasn't there, decided to take that day off, didn't tell anybody else that the employee was coming in. Employee was on the schedule, but nobody knew who he was. He walked in and the employees go, "We don't know what you need to do. The supervisor's not here." Employee turned around and walked off. I can't blame him. The supervisor didn't take the time to make sure that the employee was onboarded. Check in or check back. I think it's really important to follow up with new employees. And as an HR director, the best of the best that I saw was an organization that at 30 days after they started, they would have another orientation. They would have a follow-up orientation. And they would call the employees in, and then they would say, "Hey, what questions do you have that we didn't answer? And how can we help you? And how's your experience been?" And they give them the opportunity to gather some feedback and improve the process. So, check in on the employees, check back, monitor your turnover rates, conduct exit interviews. Not every employee is willing to fill out an exit interview when they leave, but if you can get them, then that's awesome. So we're going to move on to performance management. Performance management, it's not a form. It's not that end of the year evaluation that you check all the boxes, sign, your employee gets a 5% increase, and you move on. It's actually a continual process. It's just like the onboarding. It's a continual process. And it all centers around expectations. The employee needs to know what you expect of them, and you need to be able to let them know when they're not meeting your expectations. So make sure that the employee knows the expectations. If they are not meeting the expectations, coach them. Give and take feedback. Use your performance tools, but make sure that they know the expectations. It always comes back to that. And I will always say that you tell the employee the expectations, you let them know we're not meeting the expectations, you tell them how to meet the expectations, you coach them, and when they don't meet those expectations, you tell them again. And if they still don't meet those expectations, then they are the ones that are choosing to terminate themselves. You aren't doing it. They choose it themselves because they knew, but they clearly need to know. I've had supervisors come into my office and say, "I want to fire so-and-so, he's doing this, this, and this. He's just not doing the job." And I've said, "Have you talked to him?" No, but it's common sense and he should just know. Might be common sense for you, might be common sense for me, but you don't know that it's common sense for this brand new employee. He may be an 18-year-old kid who's never had a job before. So it's not common sense. You have to communicate your expectations. I said earlier that we use job descriptions to communicate expectations. We do that. We also do that through new hire orientation. We also do that through informal feedback and through performance evaluations. You have all kinds of tools and all kinds of opportunities to be communicating to your employees what your expectations are. So here's the tools that I think are part of managing performance. One is the courageous conversations. I love that term, courageous conversations, because sometimes that's what it takes. It takes courage to have a hard-to-have conversation with an employee. And I don't care how long you've been a supervisor. A lot of people still get nervous when they have to have that hard conversation. And the worst Worst courageous conversation. And every time I poll a group and I say, what's the hardest conversation to have with an employee? Do you guys have an idea what it might be? No? What was that? Termination? Termination is very hard. And I agree with you, but I think the hardest conversation is hygiene. Yep, it's very hard to have that conversation with an employee and tell them that they stink. Because it's very personal. And so you have to be very delicate about how you have that approach. But as a supervisor, at some point in your life, you're going to have employees come to you and say, Joe stinks, and I can't work next to him anymore. And then you have to have that conversation with Joe. But termination is a very difficult conversation, too. And I've done a lot of counseling on how to have that conversation. And then coaching and counseling is just, what is coaching? Think about a coach, a tennis coach, a soccer coach, a basketball coach. It's an ongoing, commentary on your performance and how to redirect and how to push them towards success. So it's redirection, celebration of performance. Let's not forget to tell employees when they're doing a good job. Performance improvement, these are specific formal plans. So we sit down and say, hey, employee, you're failing in these areas, and we need you to improve by a certain date, and we're going to help you. Here's how we want you to improve. For example, an employee who has terrible writing, and it's really a critical piece of their job. Employee, your writing skills are pretty weak. I'm going to send you to some writing classes. I'm going to give you the tools that you need, but you need to take those tools, you need to work on it, and we're going to follow up. And so that's what performance improvement is. Progressive correction or progressive discipline is what you might know it as. I like correction because discipline sounds, very boarding school-like. So progressive correction is a formal process where the employees put on notice. And that's your verbal, written, suspension, termination. You let them know each step of the way what they're doing wrong, how to do it right, what will happen if they keep doing it. So that's progressive correction. And those are the tools that you have. Continuous feedback, establish milestones with your employees. This is where we'll meet back in a month, we'll see how you're improving, make sure that sometimes your goals and objectives will have to be changed. Sometimes you might set a goal for your employee and it's too aggressive and it's not realistic. So you have those meetings and you reset your goals. Because the end result of any of these scenarios, the coaching, performance improvement, and progressive discipline, end result is to have a successful employee. The end result is not to terminate an employee. I've had people say that, well, HR needs all this documentation before I can terminate an employee. Well, you're darn right you do. Because we want to make sure you've done everything you can to try to redirect the employee and have a successful employee. Because it's better to keep them than to try to hire a new one. So keep your channels of communication open and coach and assist. Okay, and I already talked about the progressive discipline. So when you take disciplinary action should be taken when the employee has recurring issues, such as absenteeism or tardiness, things that you have continuously already coached them on. Or the employee has continual problems following your instructions or the company policies despite additional training, coaching, or counseling. Or the employee engages in serious misconduct, such as drug or alcohol abuse. So when they engage in serious misconduct, such as drug or alcohol abuse, harassment, physical assault, any of these, you do not have to start with a verbal warning. You don't have to say, well, we have a progressive discipline policy, so I guess I'll give you a verbal warning. Do not assault somebody again. No. You go straight to termination on those. Straight to termination for serious misconduct. You do not have to follow the steps for serious misconduct. It's really important to know that because you're at liability. If you have somebody who has violated your drug policy and you keep them on, then you're violating some of your grants and contracts that say we will enforce a drug policy. And you're putting your other employees at risk. If you keep an employee on who is violent, then you're putting your other employees at risk, and you're responsible for their health and safety as well. So go straight to termination on those cases. Documentation, just use the 5 W's. Who was involved, who who are you writing up, who might have witnessed it, what was the specific example, what was the specific scenario, where did it happen, when did it happen, and, the only time you would put why in your documentation is if the employee has explained to you why this happened. So, correcting or redirecting behavior, the goal is to redirect behavior. Again, progressive discipline goes like verbal, written, suspension, demotion, termination. And each step lays out the consequence. Each step has to lay out the consequence. If you continue this behavior, the next step will be this. And usually what we say, if you continue your behavior, next step will be progressive discipline up to and including termination. So you cover your bases. And then in the performance improvement plan is more structured to help the employee improve. So again, expectations, how to meet expectations, how you as the coach will help, and you give frequent feedback. So separation, am I okay on time? Yeah. Oh, okay. Because I don't know if I can talk any faster. Okay, separation. As was stated here, termination is the most difficult thing to do as a supervisor. And your first termination is really scary, right? First time you have to terminate an employee, you're probably more nervous and more upset than they are. So making the decision to terminate an employee and conducting the meeting are two of the most difficult responsibilities. How many of you would rather avoid terminating an employee? How many of you would rather HR do it for you? Yeah, I know. I've had many of those conversations. Will you just do it for me? Like, I'll help you, but you've got to be in the room. So the process of separation, make sure you document the process. Your documentation is really important because after an employee leaves employment, there's various things that could happen. They could, depending on what your policies are, they could file a grievance. They could file a wrongful termination. They file for unemployment, and you may not want to give unemployment to an employee that you terminated. And they will win the unemployment case every time if you didn't document. Create a transition plan. That if depends on the level of employee that you are terminating. You may be terminating somebody and giving them a severance package, or you may be have somebody trained and in the wings for when they go. Make sure that you inform key people. That's the most common complaint I hear. Nobody knew that Joe was terminated, and so you should send it, again, depending on the level of the employee or how small your organization is. You should send out a notice that Joe's no longer with us. You please direct all your inquiries to Sam. He's now taking on the workload. Notify IT. You want to remove all access for that employee. It doesn't matter if they were left on friendly terms or unfriendly terms. You don't need to have a breach of security by allowing them access beyond their dates of employment. Create a separation package if necessary. Notify benefits that they've been terminated. Make sure you get their current contact information. You need that so they can get their final W-2 at the end of the year. And if you're lucky, conduct an exit interview. It's really hard to terminate an employee and then ask them to sit down and answer questions. But your employees that leave voluntarily, what I like to do is send them the exit interview. I send a survey through SurveyMonkey after they've left, because then they don't feel like they're betraying anybody so much. They feel more comfortable answering the questions. So a lot of times they think, well, you're going to give it right to my manager, and then there's going to be retaliation before I leave. So it's nice to get that data because it gives you information on what you need to improve. I already talked about documentation, so I'm going to skip that really quick. So types of termination: voluntary, employee provides a resignation that they're leaving, or they may provide a notification that they're going to resign, or retire, they're leaving for a new job, maybe they're moving out of state. But resignation is voluntary, and then your involuntary. A couple different criteria or categories under involuntary is either unsatisfactory performance. This is when you've gone through the whole process and they still haven't met your expectations, so that would be unsatisfactory performance. You might have an organizational change which requires layoffs and reductions in force. And then you might have, severe misconduct, which those are the situations where we're going to go straight to termination. Violations of the code of ethics, policies, practices, procedures, or rules. So you have involuntary and you have voluntary. Those are the two types of terminations. Employment at will is used incorrectly a lot. Employment, when we are an at-will employer, we say we're an at-will employer, we can fire you anytime we want. Yes, you can, but should you? I mean, it's not necessarily a law, it's a doctrine. It basically says that we have a relationship where neither one of us is bound to stay or keep the other. But if you're going to use employment at will as your excuse to terminate an employee, I recommend you only do it in the first 90 days. We're going to use at will because you're just not fitting in with the organization. But after that, then you should be trying to keep that employee. You should be trying to develop them. And so using at will just to get rid of a problem employee is kind of chicken. You should actually follow the process and document them. So before the termination meeting, be prepared. Have your notes on what you want to communicate. Make sure the discussion is in private. You do not want to have it out in front of everybody else in the bullpen. Schedule a room in advance. And if you feel like there may be any kind of anger or conflict, or that there's a potential that the employee is going to act out in an inappropriate way, you might want to have a representative. You might want to have a representative anyway, so that you never have the he said, she said situation where an employee says, my female employee says, my male employee fired me, but that's because they were coming on to me. They do that. They will say things. So it's a good idea to have a witness in your termination meeting. There's no love lost after termination. So avoid any small talk. Just stay calm. Clearly state the reason for your termination. Don't make it personal. Just here's the reasons for the termination. Make it clear that they're terminating and there's not a negotiation. I've seen managers who are too soft and too wishy-washy, and so they end up in this long discussion of whether they're negotiating or whether the employee can stay. Just be very specific. Be prepared for the reaction. Give them the information on HR will handle all your benefits and your final paycheck. Give them a copy of the separation notice, and depending on your organization, you may have security walk them out. But the biggest thing is be prepared. Be prepared for a reaction, because there will be a reaction. I talked about exit interview. Oh, look at there, I'm done. Any questions? Yes? Okay. Yeah, just the last part. What was the question? Oh, yeah. No, I mean, that conversation, I think the biggest thing you point out is that, as you grow, you have to develop formal policies and procedures, or else you'll crumble, because you have to build that foundation. And I know what you're talking about. I've seen a lot of small organizations, and then they start to grow, and all of a sudden they look back and go, oh no, we don't have that foundation. And so, you don't ever want to have to write a policy after an employee has violated something serious, or you don't ever want to have to go backwards and develop things to support determination. So I really just think you just let them know, and it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much to get those foundations. All you need is your handbook and your policies and your procedures, and then you've got your foundation. And so if an employee then violates something, you've got it right there to say, yeah, but you It's right here. It's in our policies. You can't do that. And some of the really more serious infractions, like violence or harassment, those can be really big deals because those can end up being criminal. And so you need to have something, that you can go back on. Great question. Thank you. Yes? Yeah. Well, again, I go back to if you have strong policies and procedures and employment codes, hopefully it's handled within the organization. It doesn't have to go to tribal court, because I know once it goes into tribal court, then it's in that, that zone that we never know when it's going to come out, right? So, good, strong supervisory skills, good, strong management policies is really the best course of action. And I have seen where every employee issue is handled by the tribal legal team, and that, I'm HR, so I'm always going to say it's better if you have an HR department than using the tribal legal team, because it's more preventative that way. So prevent it from getting to that level is probably the best answer I can give you on that. Yes.
Being a medical issue, a disease, and can you really fire somebody for a medical related issue?
So that goes back to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the fact that tribes don't have to follow that. But from an ethical standpoint, what I've seen a lot of tribes will do is they'll say that for your first violation, then we will pay for you to go to rehab, and we will hold your job open until you get back from rehab. But after we have given you that opportunity for rehab, if you come back into the workforce and then you violate it again, then you'll be terminated. So it's an opportunity to correct that behavior that we're going to help them with. So how many of you, because I assume a lot of you have grant money and federal funds that are coming in. So most of the times when you have federal funds, you have to follow the Drug-Free Workplace Act. And so you have to have a plan in place in order to make sure that you keep your workforce drug-free. It was a good question, though, and it's one I've heard. I got one in the back.
Yes, hi. I'm Joanne Nota. I'm the director for the export program with the National Center. And we work with a lot of small businesses that have employees that they send out overseas. So which employment law would they operate under? The foreign country or if they send U.S. citizens? Is it the United States employment laws?
Okay. Ask the question again, please. I'm not sure I understood.
Okay, so we have small businesses that send employees overseas to work in other countries. Would the U.S. employment law be the law that they follow, or would it be the employment law of the other country?
I cannot answer that question. Sorry, I moved away from my mic. I can't answer that question. I assume it's the U.S., but they also have to follow the law, not just employment law, but the law of the country that they're in. But I'll look it up. I'll get some research, and I can get that information to you. Yeah, you're welcome.
Derek, so the online viewers can hear.
Probably also goes to if you're a company and you do business on the reservation. So do the tribal employment laws apply? Say you have a non-native contractor come on the reservation, which laws apply? It's probably the same thing. So, but I have another question. I think one of the things that I struggle with in the past is my employees that are a part of the Native American Church.
Okay.
And so they use peyote. And so I guess my answer to that was, as long as they declare that they're a part of the Native American Church and they demonstrate that they are, when you do random drug testing,
Yeah.
And if it does show up, they have to substantiate, why they, in this case, tested positive for peyote.
Yep. And first of all, you would have to have it in your drug and alcohol policy that there are religious exemptions for peyote. And just so that you say it up front and you set out the conditions that they have to prove that it was part of a religious ceremony and not just because they want. So I think we're out of time. Now I know I'm out of time. So, but I will, get my contact information from Yvette. I'll leave some business cards here. If you guys, have more questions, feel free to call me or email me. Probably best to email me, and I will get back to you. So thank you so much for your time and your patience. All right.